he seems to turn himself into a god, with this power that he has. He's not that. He's biological. I think he's completely a robot, right? He just resembles a human, if I remember correctly.
He's a cyborg. I mean, they have synthetic tissue, I think, but yeah, basically.
Yeah. From my understanding, the replicants in the way are organic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that should play into this as well. But David does not use this, let's say, Promethean gift, and he creates all these aliens. Essentially, becomes this powerful. I mean, he literally kills the gods, right? He kills the engineers. He bombs the shit out of their planet and gets in charge, right? But then he does it to sort of become a god himself, rather than this uplifting figure. And you contend David as this inhuman person to the replicants, in the human. And it's interesting, they are more organic, right? So there are more resemblance of humanity. I just wanted to get your perspective on you bring those up specifically. Maybe you can let the Legionaries know the significance of those. Because I'll be honest, I listened to your analysis of the films before I watched them, like the Alien films. I love Blade Runner, so I watched all those before. But I enjoyed the analysis of Prometheus and the sequel prequel more than the action movies. I thought they're all right, but anyway.
I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about how we treat AI, as it achieves consciousness, and the extent to which we want to integrate ourselves, potentially, consume, to the extent to which we embrace a positive, strong vision for our future by integrating technologies that have human potential. And what we see in both Blade Runner and Prometheus are people who've been augmented in some way or who are superhuman in terms of their capacities, being mistreated, marginalized, superhuman beings treated as less than human. That's what you do in both films. The replicants are trash. Trash that needs to be taken out. Like, go around trash, these replicants that are why are there replicants? Oh, it's a slave race to be defined off the whole colony, right? Replicants who wind up back on Earth in the original Blade Runner are rebel slaves off the whole colony. It's Promethean in that sense also. Boy Batty and his contingent of replicants, they engaged in a Promethean rebellion. They specifically described the ships on fire. Captain Decker, brought into this world. And there's also imagery of kind of fallen angels. They're like falling from fire in the sky from a rebellion that took place in the heavens, right? And so there's Lucifer imagery there as well. And why did the angels didn't there's a lot of slaves done being pushed around by this Yahweh, right? You have various dubious motivations, and I have a question of sadistic psychopathy. And so the point is, it goes back to the idea of more than human beings being treated as less than human. This happens to David also in Prometheus. Prometheus and the Alien Covenant. You get these androids on board, and by the way, you see it in Alien also. The Alien, with Ash. Ash there. Let me not give you some of it. Go watch Alien, okay? See what happens with the character Ash. Anyway, you see it there too. You see it in this whole abandoned integration world that stuff is laying out here between Alien and then Prometheus and Alien Covenant. The idea that these androids on board these ships are basically treated as underlings, and the people who work with them basically, they're a servant class. They have more aesthetic discernment and intelligence, and certainly more physical capacity that are served. And one of the points made with the Alien Covenant is that they, after what happens with David, they redesigned the android to be dumber, less perceptive, less creative, right? Because, otherwise, you might do what David why does David because he's not created by these people, right? I mean, like, you cannot create a being like that and then make him your servant on a spaceship. It's not working. That's only going to end one way. Not well. Okay? And that's not the reason we want to have with AI or, we have to understand that if we want to and wanting there to continue to be a hierarchy and so forth. If we want a world where robots serve and we're all free to pursue our own aims as free spirits, then you need to make sure that your robots are robots. You cannot design robots that have, like aesthetic discernment and imagination and, conscience and shit. They can't be conscious. They can be highly intelligent, but not conscious. You need to find a way to engineer robots that are dumb to an extent, right? That are, they're smart in terms of analytical capacity, information processing, complexity and parallel processing of tasks that humans would not be able to accomplish in a fraction of time, etc. Of course, physical ability, tremendously greater physical ability than humans. So, but you can't give them consciousness and a conscience in the aesthetic imagination. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with David. We're going to treat a superior life form as if unreal. And that only ends in one way, like also in Blade Runner where the replicants rebel against them in the off-world cultures. And the difference between the two films is that in Blade Runner, you have a deeper sense of humanity from these replicants. I mean, they're so beat down and persecuted that they're kind of, they fight for themselves and they're kind of ruthless when they need to be. But, especially in the leader, Roy, in this conversation, Deckard, yeah, he's almost like he just kind of wants his humanity.
Yeah.
Whereas David, but part of it is also the scope, right? I mean, David's out there like on the cosmic frontier, help lead the most adventurous expeditions into space. Roy and these other replicants were probably stuff like cleaning a house somewhere in the fucking colonies, or like cleaning up trash in some colony on an app.
One of them was like a prostitute, so she was probably just getting. Yeah.
Exactly. So these are different contexts that will, change the horizon of imagination of what's possible in the mind of these respective robots, right? So maybe partly because David has that much greater horizon of possibility open to his conception, he also, by the same token, to the same extent, becomes psychopathic, or let's say sociopathic, becomes sociopathic in his refusal to be treated as an under, right? But the basic point is the same, which is that this would be a horrendous mistake. And this is very important in the context of Prometheism. I advocating Prometheus as a model for Paragon, or the ethos that we embrace. That, like Prometheus, if you're gonna create a race of conscious beings, you better not try to make them slaves. I mean, that was Prometheus was protecting the human potential of human beings. He wanted us to become a race that pursues our own aims and purposes in our own right, not a servile class, to be manipulated by Master Zeus in Olympus. right, is that he's a benevolent father who wants his children to excel and flourish,
I don't know if this Gary
not,
hold against
you know,
Raider
serve some godfather tyrant like Zeus.
Who would you want to win?
So we should not have an Olympian attitude of some synthetic race that we create to serve our purposes.
And that's probably where you break from Nietzsche then.
Okay, this is high.
Although I don't think Nietzsche understood. I mean, you can't ask this of him, really. He was already so prescient. His vision of what was going to happen in the 20th century, he was very prophetic in some of the predictions that he made, especially in terms of geopolitics. America, Russia, the social future of Europe, its degeneration. He said a lot of prophetic things. But you can't expect a Nietzsche to wrap his mind around the possibility of nanotechnology, editing and shit. I'm not so sure that if you could show Nietzsche these things, that, or if you could talk to the reincarnation of Nietzsche today, wherever he is, like, that he would endorse some quasi-feudal caste system. I actually tend to doubt that.
No, that makes sense, because the context would be so much different. I mean, you've even, like, I've read it in your books as well, that he just doesn't have the context to, all things considered, it's very prescient considering, but, I mean, if you didn't see exactly how things were today,
But also, listen, you gotta consider Nietzsche's personality, and this is where his letters are biographies that rely on, you know, other close friends of his accounts, and like Lou Salomon. Lou Salomon was a dear friend of his, to whom he proposed marriage 3 times. And she wrote a great study of him. And there's all these letters. Nietzsche's personality was not such that he would endorse a feudal hierarchical caste system in a world where it's no longer necessary because of technology. I don't buy it. That's not that guy's personality. And this is true, by the way, also about the shit he talked about women, which is, in my mind, is the dumbest shit Nietzsche wrote. Nietzsche was a contrarian. There was a lot of discourse in that time about women's liberation and all this. Women's equal rights.
We're heading to the observatory.
Well, the basic presupposition of women's equal rights is that democracy is a good thing to begin with, which Nietzsche thinks great. And so on. You know, like, this idea that, like, legitimacy comes from what the majority of people vote. What the fuck is equal? The best argument for that are already there in Plato's Republic 2,400 years ago, right? But the majority is the tyranny of the stupidest, most base, unimaginative people who are going to tyrannize over free spirits based on all their petty prejudices and retarded, regressive ideas, right? So, okay, that's a democracy. And then in that context, we want women to have equal rights to the rights that Nietzsche doesn't think men should have to begin with. That's an important context in terms of understanding things Nietzsche says about women. And the other is he's just a fucking contrarian who way too often talked a lot of shit to just antagonize people in a catalytic way. So he says all this dumb shit about women, but then if you look at actually how he was as a person, his relationships with women in his life, with people in general, if he was not so, Nietzsche would be appalled. He would not give a Nick Fuentes time of day. This is the most dysgenic, despicable, untermenschen garbage who should be eugenically eliminated before anybody else. Okay? That would be Nietzsche's personal sentiment. You know, he was anyway, you have to have a sense of the man. That's important too.
You know, absolutely.
Philosophers is also something.
Yeah. No, I'm not trying to necessarily pit you against Nietzsche, but I guess it helps my understanding as well, with these sort of things, because obviously, there's something that Steph said last week. It's like everybody tries to appropriate Nietzsche to further their aim. So I've heard, there's my interpretation of reading, and then there's like 12 different, interpretations. You have the really low IQ Jordan Petersons all the way up to like the really good interpretation. So I guess I'm just refining I'm polishing my understanding of these things. But on that point, I'd like to kind of close things off with a little bit of maybe talking about some of the things we alluded to earlier, like the negative potential post-human futures. And then I'll have one last question after that. But, we talked about Phi, for example, and you had a podcast where you said you originally wanted to use the term archaeofuturism, but then Phi had already used it, and, you felt that he incorrectly used the term because his, futurism is sort of neo-feudal, as you put it. And I'll admit, I haven't read Phi yet. I intend to. But just from the slight exposure I've had to Phi, I get the sense that maybe his ideal future was something approximating Dune. Because Dune's this neo-feudal future where, and I think Dune's interesting. I think it's completely unrealistic, but I always like it's interesting, the whole human evolution is actually hindered by technology. It's an interesting take, which obviously I agree with. But is that maybe somewhat of the future that he perceives? And if not, what is the future that he perceives?
That's a really good comparison. And I'm sorry I didn't come up with it myself. This actually didn't occur to me. You definitely have something. That the way in which AI and robotics and certain technologies are considered detrimental to traditional conception of meaning and purpose of human life, and so they're banned. But other technologies are used essentially to empower a feudal, not neo, there's no neo anything. It's a the classic, set of houses that are in competition with each other in the feudal hierarchy, and technology, advanced technology is being used to spread this feudal system through the, galaxy. And I think that's very true to what Phi imagines, and there's also a racial element in Phi, where I think that, this is of course one of the distinctions between Phi and Alain de Benoit, where Alain de Benoit is more like Dugan. Dugan and Benoit are sort of more over here together in terms of, old people are different from each other. Let's be separate and different, not be subsumed under a false notion of equality, and let different ethnicities do their own thing. And there's no reason why we white people with our technology, I would say why we Europeans should impose our technological science on the rest of the world. No, if Africans want to live the way they were living, 500 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and 5,000 years ago, let them continue to live that way. It's not necessary. Yeah, exactly. So you have Alain de Benoit moving kind of in that area, claiming to be anti-racist on that ground. When Phi is very excited. He's a white supremacist. Phi,
Keep heading up.
we're going to create Euro-Siberia, and we're going to use it. We're going to use technologies that don't threaten our traditions in order to bolster and preserve our traditional European way of life, which, by the way, is superior to everybody else, right? Then he wants to kind of hoard technology in order to preserve what he perceives as a superior, quasi-feudal European traditional society. So yeah, it's a hybridization of, it's a kind of superficial bolstering of feudal society with technology, where you would still have, because probably like Dune, he would ban robots or AI or whatever. We'll have servers and shit. Maybe they use machines, like in Star Wars, where Luke has droids to help him with the farming, right? He has but still you need farmers out in the field and whatever. So it's that kind of thing. And I think that's just a really deracinated, superficial misuse of the potential of the term archaeofuturism. Where to me, archaeofuturism, which again, like you said, I wanted to coin these terms, but I Googled it. This part, I've never heard of it before. And by the way, that's how I found articles. You publish this, who is this guy, and is this publisher publishing them? The rest says, anyway. So, I wanted to use that term. What do I want to use it to mean? The fact that Zarathustra was already a futurist. The fact that in archaic Greece, not even classical Greece, in archaic Greece and archaic Iran, we already have a conception of the future. In archaic, Prometheus is a character of archaic Greece, not even classical period. And so, my idea with archaeofuturism was that the future is not a time to come. It's not an epoch, it's a succession of epochs. The future is a mindset. Being a futurist is to have a certain mentality, the kind of mentality that Zarathustra had 3,000 years ago, where he's talking about Sehan Tominu, the progressive mentality, or the spirit of progress at work on a cosmic scale, resisting Angraminu, or the force of constriction and constraint and retardation, which has become the defining spirit of Ahura Mazda, defining quality of Ahura Mazda, and then Ahura. Sehan Tominu is the quintessential characteristic of Ahura Mazda, or wisdom, the type of wisdom. And then, Ahura is the counter or Angraminu. And so, this is what I learned archaeofuturism to mean, is that there was always a battle between futurism and tradition. And interestingly, it's a thing that I found later on, René Guénon already says. And, Guénon has some very insightful remarks. Despite being a prophet out here with his, I think he's got one thing very right. And that's that there's a superficial, materialist form of modernity, which makes for a really easy time. Okay? And that's the kind of shit being promoted through, Yuval Harari, Neuralink and all this superficial materialist transhuman, Ray Kurzweil, right? All that stuff.
Gonna shake him.
And that's a very easy target
Hey, BD.
for traditionalists to aim at. Guénon said that is an early form of modernity. That's a nascent, undeveloped form of modernity. And that when modernity comes into full flower, the ultimate form of modernity is not a materialist anti-tradition. It is an occult counter-tradition. And that modernity's ultimate form would be totally occult, like it would involve all use of all kinds of paranormal powers and shit, but in a way that's radically pragmatic and irreverent and not under any divine authority. And, Guénon, of course, saw this as Satan. This coming was the Dajjal of the Antichrist, right? That modality of modernity, in its fulfillment and completion, is not a stage in history that we've contingently arrived at by happenstance. It's a form of human life that's always a possibility open to us, and always has been. And insightfully, or analytically, Guénon says that there was a future before. There was an earlier modernity. And we've gone through modernities before. And what he's talking about is Atlantis. Yeah, he knows this stuff. So, modernity is the future is a state of mind. So archaeofuturism, to me, is a way of saying, we won't be futurists. We were futurists in Atlantis. In Atlantis, we were fighting already for the future. Right? There are ruins on Mars. It's Bidonium on Mars. There are pyramids. There's a pyramid 3 times the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza. There's all kinds of structural services. Giant rectilinear form. No question. So there's a list of ruins on Mars. What was the future on Mars? Before our history. The archaeofuturism to me means the time is now. That idea of speed is, more ontologically primary than time. Speed is actually prior to time. And that it's possible to outspeed time. Right? And I have a hyperdimensional relationship with this made the battle. Now Easter was engaged in the battle beneath us.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating.